Terminology in challenging circumstances. What a title to a conference. It opens up a whole box of opportunities and topics. And I kept my title deliberately vague because there is a lot that I could zero in on. So I would like to start first by giving you my point of view, my background, so that you understand where I'm coming from. I will give you some of the challenges that I face on a daily basis, or at least on a weekly or monthly basis. That is quite often. And then I would like to discuss a little bit the complex work environments that, of course, all of us in terminology work are facing often, and how we dealt with it in ISO 12616. A particular one is job titles, and so I'll go a little bit deeper into that, and then I'll make some suggestions for the second part of 12616, so that we have something to look forward to. So my point of view is that of an external terminology consultant in the United States. I'm obviously a German native speaker, as you can hear by my accent. And I've worked almost exclusively in the IT industry, so with large IT companies. That has pros and cons, as I will tell you about in a little bit. I most of the time support large-scale translation projects. That's not to say that terminology is not used for other objectives, but my main concern is always in terminography for translation-oriented environments. I deal with a mix of in-house colleagues and then also with a large part of external resources of people who sit in their home offices, who work for language service providers. That too is probably not unfamiliar to many of you, but I just see it on a very large scale. That also means that almost all my meetings and even almost all the trainings are in an online format. When I graduated with my master's degree, I really was very much in favor of being on site for education, and I have since completely switched my attitude there because I also teach in two online programs at the Monterey Institute as well as NYU, and both of them are online master's programs, either in translation or in localization project management. So I know it works, but it certainly also has some challenges. Apart from training, I do implementations of terminology management systems, and once they're implemented, and if there is no terminology resource for English available, then I also do terminology work, and I participate in other terminology projects as well. So what do I see as a consultant? Well, I thought about it as almost an iceberg, where the people I work with on a day-to-day basis are the ones, the tip of the iceberg that is above the water, that is easy to work with, for the most part anyway. But of course, in this large country, that tip of the iceberg, that those colleagues that I work with on a daily basis, are informed by the rest of the population. And here is a little bit of a cultural comparison between the United States and Europe. In the US, based on sources that I looked up from the US Census and also the Pew Research Center, only about 20 to 25% of the population speaks more than one language. For Europe, according to my source, and let me just check, the source was from The Guardian, actually quoting Eurostat, 54% of the population speak more than one language. It's probably not news to you, but that obviously has an impact on large-scale environments because it's just not a given that we think about other languages. We sometimes don't even think about the main language in the IT industry, the source language. Content publishers have been struggling with that to a certain degree in their profession. The next point here is that in this underbelly, so to speak, not too many people think about classification, which is at the root of our work. And while maybe it's not the main focus anymore necessarily, it is certainly one of the foundations. Maybe not too many people have learned about Greek philosophy, and therefore it's not as rooted in the thinking of the culture as it is in my native Germany, for example. Therefore, there is also not this desire to standardize, which I definitely see with German colleagues that I work with, for example, at companies like Zeiss. However, I am blessed with the tech literacy that my colleagues and my clients bring to the job, and also a strong interest in technology. So that's certainly a benefit that I see on a day-to-day basis. One more point that I want to mention here is education. While most people who enter into a job in Europe have a degree in that particular profession, that is not the case in the United States. And again, it's a generalization. It's not true for everybody, of course, but the fact that people think anything can be taught on the job has impact on the day-to-day of a consultant. In fact, you could even consider myself being trained on the job, as my master's was in translation and I do not have a master's degree in terminology management. So what are some of the typical challenges? Obviously, I have a lot of monolingual decision makers. That's not in and of itself bad. Decision makers who know that they're lacking in one area may just be really smart and get the right input from the right people. But that has led to decisions even just recently, such as, well, we need to expand into the Portuguese market in Portugal. Oh, we are already dealing with Brazil. Let's just use that as a basis for our translation and manage terminology for Brazil and Portugal as one language in the term base. And of course, those of you who work with these markets know that they need to be managed as two. Another aspect that comes in here is that decision makers, sometimes very high up in the company, might say, this is a new thing, a new concept that we're introducing, and the term, note well, not the proper name of a product or feature, must remain in English. So they're imposing terminology, terms, on a vast number of other languages without concern of what that will look like for the native speakers of that language. In that one particular case that I'm thinking of, the decision came from very high up in the company, and the decision makers lower down were not able to speak up against that decision. A year later, somebody else replaced the project manager at the bottom of the chain, so to speak, in the company, and they said, well, this doesn't make sense, let's change it. So a year later, a particular term I'm thinking of was changed, but of course that's costly. What I also see, and this is still stunning to me in this day and age, is that language service providers that are big partners for my direct clients don't always have the skills in-house or within their teams to support terminology projects. And the assumption is always that everybody who is a language service provider or a project manager at an LSP has terminology management skills, and that is not true, and that can sometimes lead to quite complex situations. Another one, of course, is that the assumption is, oh, we just translate terminology. And I saw it in a few submissions for this conference, so I would really encourage my colleagues here to not think of terminology work as translation. I call it research and documentation of target terminology. I would never call it translation, because the assumption is always I send out a list of terms and they come back and are perfectly documented in the other language, and that's just simply not that easy. And finally, the concept of a subject matter expert is vague. because we don't have people with degrees in all these professions, especially in the IT industry. And therefore, when I'm looking, and the IT industry, I have to say, also has the challenge that we're looking for people who are skilled in software development, but also in the subject matter in the subject matter of the software. So we may have financial software where we need financial experts in order to answer terminological questions or conceptual questions, and we may not necessarily find them. So those were some day-to-day issues, and here is a chart that we developed in the course of ISO 12616. And we had so much material from the get-go, or in the course of working together, that we realized we need to break the standard in two parts. And now how do we do that? Well, we had to find a fairly clear line between what we then considered the simpler environments, which are depicted here on the left-hand side. That one example would be a freelance translator in their home office who work with two languages, who are the only contributor, the only user, who support only their translation process. And then on the other end of the spectrum, complexer environments such as in-house translation teams at language service providers, where you are supporting possibly multiple processes with terminology work, so not just translation, but also controlled authoring or search engine optimization, things like that. And there are usually a high number of languages, a lot of active contributors, a lot of users, of course. And the tools infrastructure, the last point I want to make on this slide, is usually much, much more complex than you would have in a freelance office. So what we did for part one, we had to find already definitions for the roles that we're covering, and we covered the terminologist, of course, who does terminology work as a main function of their professional activity. But then that's not true for a freelance translator, for example. We had to also name that role who does terminology work as an ancillary function of other professional activities. That's what we needed to do for part one. But let's go a little bit deeper into job roles and titles in the localization industry. A very interesting presentation by Manuela Noske, then from Gala. She has since moved on. But at the ATA conference, she looked at the roles not only at client companies, but also at language service providers. And generally, we can say we find these 6 roles at each of them. You see, most of them are the same, but you have, of course, the supplier manager at the client company and the account manager on the other side at the language service provider. So far so good. Those are the generalized role that she identified. But then she looked at the registrants of the webinars that Gala ran in 2018. They had 34 webinars and 4,000 registrants, and there were over 1,600 unique registrants. And then she analyzed how they registered for these webinars, what title did they offer. And she came up with an incredibly high number of unique job titles for those registrants, even though they should have come out of these, basically of this pool of 6 different job roles at those 2 different work environments. And the number that she found was 961 job titles that are used in the localization industry. So you can imagine that that has some consequences. And for the person who will take on part 2 of translation-oriented terminography in more complex environments, it will really have an impact in the tools infrastructure and the workflow that goes along with that. You can already see we have many participants here, and if the job titles are not somewhat unique, then that will lead to consequences. What consequences? Well, we don't necessarily know when we come from the outside, either as tools provider implementing a particular system or as consultant supporting that, who will do what and even who can do what. I mean, who has which skills is very, very unclear often, and in every environment it is different. As consultant, when I am on a project longer term, that's actually okay. I can get into that. But I'm thinking of people like tools providers who implement tools or who do trials of their tools with various companies and then assist them during the trial period. They may be speaking to 3, 4 different companies in a day, and everyone wants to do this differently. So my suggestion for ISO 12616 Part 2 for the more complex environments is, of course, workflows in terminology management environments, in our terminology workflows need to be documented. But ideally, we also define the roles that are necessary there for a generic environment. We call them particular roles and give them titles and then use them consistently, because there is certainly a need for that in our industry. With that, I would like to thank you for inviting me, and I look forward to a discussion.